Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. As you know, this is a discussion between you and Steve Chu, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to be here. Thank you, Steve, for making time for us from California, and thank you, everyone from Asia Pacific. I know you all went through a rigorous selection procedure from the Asian Medical Students Union at National University of Singapore. And so congratulations for being selected, and thank you for applying. The way this will work is that I'll give you each a chance to make some points and if you want, phrase a question to Steve, and then Steve will reply. And then if whatever time allows, we can open it up for discussion and then move on to the next one of you, so that I make sure that you all get the chance to speak. And as you know, this video will be played alongside the Nobel Prize dialogue in Singapore next Tuesday on the future we want together. And also we'll use clips of this during the session, specifically on climate change. So just to start us off, I'm going to ask Steve to make a few introductory comments, and then we'll begin.
Okay, first, glad that you're all here, and happy to have this discussion with you. So let me frame this by saying, if you think about energy, climate change, food, sustainability, getting out of poverty, it merges into one big thing. And for example, if we're expecting that rainfall patterns will change, we've seen this, but it's going to be more changes of rainfall patterns that will affect food production. And the reservoirs and the water stresses will be increased. If you had unlimited clean energy, you can turn salt water into fresh water. But with limited amounts, there's something that's an issue. Power generation around the world is roughly a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions. Depending on how you count them, if you consider agriculture, the raising of food for us, for animals, and the methane and the N2O, the fertilizer runoff, which both methane and N2O are very potent greenhouse gases. And if you give it not the 100-year average, but the time it really is bad, 20 years, agriculture and forestry, that sort of stuff is equal and maybe even greater than the power sector, electricity generation. So agriculture is a huge part of this problem. And when people talk about going to zero emissions, you need electricity generation, transportation, agriculture, process heat to make chemicals, plastics, steel, concrete. Even if you decarbonize or dramatically change the way we make steel and concrete, we still need a lot of heat. And then finally, plastics, we need a lot of heat with present technology. So the problem is huge. We don't have all the technologies today if we want to keep energy prices within a factor of 2, and so that's another issue, because energy prices hit the poorest people of the world the worst. So those are the challenges of food, energy, growing prosperity. I'm hoping that the United States will set examples, so far not, of getting to more vegetarian diets, less meat, because if everybody adopts the American diet, we don't have a big enough planet. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about, and there are some technologies that are very exciting, but I'm going to leave it at that. So that's just to frame. Oh, one more thing. It takes 3 or 4 decades to make this huge change, because it affects the infrastructure of everything. It won't happen in 10 years or even 20 years. And even if electric vehicles, small light duty weight electric vehicles, become the dominant purchase choice within 15 years, that means dominant means 60%. All the internal gasoline combustion engines will be on the road for 15 or 20 more years since they've been purchased. So that gives you a sense of the inertial lag of what we're looking at as well. Okay, so with all that not so good news, I just open it to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. And may I just one more framing comment is just before you all came in, Steve was mentioning that he's in California in the midst of an extraordinary heat wave. Just tell us about that. Tell them about that.
Well, yesterday, just outside my home, it was 108. And where I normally used to bike ride, it was 112 at the peak. But it was triple digit for the better part of 6 to 8 hours. And it's still in double digit, it's triple digit today. Our house doesn't have any air conditioning. And so how do we survive? We open all the windows at night, try to cool the house down as much as possible. All our blinds are light colored, light scattering, so you don't need lights. We do have a barbecue in the back, so we're going to do all our cooking in the back so we generate no heat. And we hope we make it through these next couple of days. The nights are much hotter, and we are having rolling blackouts in the area because of this. And and California is perennially on fire now. Our fire season is eight months out of a year, and so we see these effects in spades, and the water shortages. We have a 20-year drought, effectively, and so water rationing is going to become severe.
Well, globally, this is the right conversation to be having. Right. Okay, let's kick off. There's no particular order for asking you to speak, so I'll just go randomly. And if people want to jump in, wave their hands on a particular topic, and then I'll bring you in on that topic. But I'll get to you all. Let's just start with Elaine, please. And if you could just say who you are and where you're from before you speak, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much, Steven, for your open introduction. My name is Elaine, and I'm from Malaysia. My background is actually from medicine. And you mentioned about food system. May I know what is the current view about the food system currently, and what do you think about the main obstacle for food system right now for sustainability?
Well, we've gotten very good at producing a lot of food with limited increase in land over the past 50 years. Breeding crops, even further back 100 years ago, artificial fertilizers, all good things. And so we can sustain, I mean, we have 7.7 billion people going to probably 11 billion by the end of this century. And the question is, as people's wealth improve, which is a good thing, they have more nutritional demands, and for very poor countries, you do want more protein and more meat. And the question is, how do you get this protein, and possibly does it all have to be from meat, or can you get a lot of vegetables? Well, there are vegans, but there are some people. So the good news is there is becoming to be a shift. The food production, I'm going to tell you about the most exciting things with new biology, which is there are people now having microbes that enter into symbiotic relationships with roots of plants, starting with corn, but we want to do this for rice, wheat, all the major grains. So you don't use nitrogen-based fertilizer. So you stop the greenhouse gas emissions from making the fertilizer, and the N2O runoff you stop. And so those are the major contributors. If you can do this with modern biological techniques, right now we can replace half the fertilizer corn, but you really want to go to 100% if possible. Those are some examples. The meat, is a lot of the world does not like any genetically modified crops. I think we've been doing genetic modification for centuries, breeding and other things. A good example of a genetic modification is they take a protein from a bacteria, they put it in eggplant. They also put in cotton and other things. So you don't have to use lots of insecticides. So the people in Bangladesh and India love it, because they used to be drowning in insecticides. It's very expensive, and it was very bad for their health. And so with this bacteria, you can cut up virtually all the insecticides. That's a good example. Roundup Ready is a bad example that you, but golden rice, I think, is a good example of vitamin A. And so we have the ability to improve the food production, the nutrients I can dream of putting in proteins that you would want in plants that would be things that you normally get from animals. If you want to make non-dairy cheese, you want to get the plants to grow casein, one of the essential proteins to make really good tasting cheese. I think all these things are possible. In the end, not only want to make it possible, I want to make it so it's the food of choice, so that we can raise everybody's prosperity. They can eat nutritious, good food at low cost. So I think I'm very bullish on this, but we've got to have incentives for the farmers, and then they've got to make a profit. For them, it's all about the plant. Can they make money? Can they survive and prosper? And so that will have to be, but I'm bullish on this. So that's one example. Is that helpful?
Yes, for sure, it's helpful. And thank you so much for answering. And I'll pass it back to you, Abby.
Okay, all right. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on this issue of.
If anyone wants to add or subtract anything.
Yeah, okay, please, Pok, go ahead. Add.
I just want to agree with that point, Stephen, about incentives. I'm based in New Zealand currently, and I think definitely the farmers are feeling a bit of a pinch. The agriculture sector is definitely weighing in pretty hard, and if we don't have that transition plan, it's just not going to happen. The farmers are coming on strike, and I think it's many factors. Like I have colleagues whose parents are farmers, and there are multiple angles to this issue, and it is rather a complex one. So I just want to weigh in on that.
By the way, ruminant animals, sheep, cattle. There are other things. A lot of the greenhouse gases is from the microbes that burp, and we are looking at people are looking at trying to have them have a diet so they don't decrease the number of microbes. You can do this with seaweed and cattle, but the cattle don't like it. People are actually thinking of vaccinating them when they're born, so they decrease the number of microbes. It appears as though you can go way down, and the cattle don't seem to mind. I suspect the same with sheep. So we're not trying to put the farmers out of business. We're trying to make them more sustainable, and it's very important because they are feeling very besieged in New Zealand, the United States, everywhere around the world. And the last thing we want is to say, no government is going to tell me what to eat or what I can raise on my land.
Tassilo.
Yes, thank you. Tassilo, 20 years. I'm currently in Germany, so it's 2 a.m. here, but happy to be here. I was thinking, because F&B is quite an interesting topic. What is your take on the transparency in, for example, menus? I feel like awareness within for consumers is a really crucial topic. And I've got this picture of maybe not F&B, but it's the shoe. Adidas released it, and on the top it's got the carbon footprint of all the cycles. And I feel like if we have more transparency, especially when it comes to food, the consumer decisions would be much different if they actually understand and can actually differentiate between the different products.
I think that's a good idea for food labeling and supermarkets and places like that. I'm not so sure people who are splurging in restaurants are going to be in the mood, to take their date or their wife once in a week, once in a month, or if you're like me, once a year on the menu to have extensive labels. Menus do now have calories and things like that. They have what's vegan, what's not, but food labeling would be good because people in supermarkets, at least I do, I will look at how much sodium there is, how much salt, this, that, the other thing, how many calories there are, but also the carbon footprint, and having a uniform labeling would be good. It would be an incentive for producers as well, so that they can try to do things, low tillage farming, things of that nature, so that they too can look. But it requires overhead and costs. But I think I'm supportive of that for sure. By the way, it's very generational. I think people your age are making this transition very quickly. Many people have become vegetarian, vegan, or certainly a lot less meat. My wife and I have a lot less meat. Meat is, in the olden days in Chinese food, meat was used as a flavoring. And as China got wealthier, then it became mostly meat. But the way I cook it at home, it's still used as a flavoring. I mean, just a few ounces of meat and lots of vegetables, and and so that plus good vegetarian recipes, which are, by the way, are improving, would also help, right? It was considered, a bunch of weird little people over here. And so the driver of that would also be good. So all these things are good, but it's generational. I think when the older generations, if they're used to eating meat every meal, sometimes it's very hard to break that. If you have grandparents who have enough wealth to buy a lot of meat, you might see this yourself. So
it's such an interesting point about the carbon footprint awareness, and the generational aspect of it. Can I just ask everybody, do you put your hands up if you do carefully monitor the carbon footprint of how you live? I don't, I'm afraid. Tassilo, you do.
Oh, by the way, if you look up the carbon footprint, not all meat is the same. Beef is huge because of all the methane. If you look at beef versus pigs are half. Chicken is again a half. Okay? And chicken's still more than eating vegetables for sure, but they're pretty efficient. And so we're talking factors of 2 or 3. And so now all of a sudden we're, if we're going to have sausage, we have chicken sausage. We're going with levered meat. We're heavily favoring chicken rather than beef, right? Because of the carbon footprint of the beef. And it's mostly the methane and the huge, well, anyway, it's complicated, but.
And may I just ask for my own clarification? How accurate are those carbon footprint numbers
That's
these
a
days?
good question. And so the only way I can tell is, I look at various things you find on the internet and compare numbers. And occasionally you look at but it's hard because, what's the carbon footprint of, if you want to minimize energy and carbon footprint, you want feedlots. Right? It's extravagant to have free range animals, cattle, for example. It's very costly, very everything. And so there's all sorts of things that are going the other way if you're talking about big ruminants like cattle and dairy cows. And then dairy cattle, it's not quite as bad as cattle, but they live 4 or 5 years, but they're still burping a lot. And then milk substitutes are becoming pretty popular. Soy milk is always pretty good. Oat milk is good. Almond milk is not because of the water demands of almonds. And so then you look at these things because it's not just carbon footprint a la this or that, it's also water and water usage. And water usage directly goes into energy as well. So it's complicated.
Okay, lots of people wanted to come in, which is lovely. I'll come to you. Tassilo, it was your point, so do you want to come first and then I'll go to Pauline?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, no, I completely agree, but what I think is that for example, now we look at the food ingredients in the supermarket. What are the ingredients in the food? I feel like if you have the same footprint of carbon right next to that, consumers would become much more aware of what they actually, really produce on CO2 themselves or other greenhouse gases, and
Carbon and water. Don't separate
and water. Exactly. Yeah.
Don't separate out water.
No, exactly.
And efficient land use, all those things. But carbon first, water second.
Okay.
Pauline, please.
Hi. I'm Pauline, I'm from Singapore, and I just wanted to ask, do you think it's governments who should take the first step? Because I feel like they can sort of control the supply and all to affect demand and how people make their decisions.
It depends on what they're trying to do. I think governments play a huge role in, there's two ways of controlling what I would call large pollution. One is you make it illegal and fine people, and the other is you give it incentives and you tax it, or you give incentives to help less polluting methods of doing something get economic advantage. But in order to do that, because they have to replace incumbents, they have to be actually better than the incumbents. Being equally good will only work for a small subset of the people, because the incumbents will push very hard to survive, right? So you just recognize, it's survival instinct. And so governments can be very good. Now, all new industries, it's rare that something new comes along so quickly without subsidy that it just takes over. The automobile industry was pretty good and was one of the fastest infrastructure changes in the world, but we in the United States were subsidizing the oil industry. They were having huge subsidies to form the infrastructure for the fuel for the automobiles and other things. So there were subsidies going on, and so it's, even when you think there was not a subsidy, there are subsidies. In fact, we still have fossil fuel subsidies for oil and gas in the United States. So decreasing some of these subsidies would be the right thing to do, or eliminating them. The trouble is many developing countries have huge energy subsidies, and if they got rid of them, they would cause riots. In fact, that has happened in several countries. And so and even today in the United States, when the price of gasoline went up because of Ukraine and other issues, the president took away the gasoline tax, the federal gasoline tax, at a tax holiday, and urged states to take away their gasoline tax. Now, the federal tax on gasoline is 19.3 cents a gallon, whereas in Europe, it's on a gallon basis, it's probably about $2 or $3. And the last time it was raised was in 1992. There is no courage in increasing gasoline taxes in the US. It's the surest way to get unelected. And even though you know better, and they felt tremendous pressure to do this. Now, all these prices and energy prices are very, I for years with a whole bunch, many other people saying you have a gasoline tax, it's revenue neutral. It's an anti-progressive tax because it affects the poor the most. You give back the money directly to people, don't spend it on new programs in relationship to their inverse relationship to their wealth. Okay, because if you get cleaner energy, you're going to increase energy prices for sure. So you help out the poorest people because they have the biggest burden. But so far, this has not really taken hold. So governments can do that. Research and development is great. They do that. That's a public good. The tax benefits is a good thing. Being able to help industries by loaning money at lower interest rates or guarantee something, those are all policies that work. The regulatory side is a little bit harder for water pollution of chemicals. That's the way the US chose to do it. And it works. I mean, but carbon is much more universal an issue and more expensive. And so this mixture of incentives and things coming from government are absolutely necessary. In the end, as a scientist, now doing some of my research on batteries, you hope to invent something so much better that, that it replaces a gasoline vehicle. If it costs the same as an internal combustion engine car, can charge in 5 minutes, goes 300 miles, then the show is over because the operating costs are so much less. But we don't have that. They're still more expensive. And because of material shortages, they're even getting more expensive. So I spend my time trying to get lithium out of seawater. I spend my time making better batteries, the hopes that that does something. And meanwhile, the US government is giving subsidies on when you buy an electric vehicle. Okay. So it's going to be a mixture of both. And you need that. The public seriousness is going to help a lot, because in the United States, in the rest of the world, climate change is pretty visible, even in the reddest states.
So
very visible.
Back to Tassilo's point that just putting the information on packaging makes people aware of it, of the problem.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pauline. Pock, you were next, please.
Thank you. Steven, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Pock. I'm actually a climate change and sustainability consultant at Ernst & Young EY. So we kind of deal with some niggly stuff when it comes to energy and agriculture. I actually had a question when it comes to energy. And one of the kind of academics I've been following, Simon Mycox, has been kind of like, he used to work in mining, and he's come up with research papers about how rough our transition is going to actually become. And one of the issues is actually because when we look at fossil fuels and coal, they're incredibly energy dense, and they really help our societies to function because of how energy dense they are. Coal, it's I think like the term they use is energy return on energy invested. I don't have an energy background, so feel free to correct me, but I think it's 80 units for coal, whereas for hydro and solar, it's 50 and 7 to 9.1 units. So it's kind of, it's like how the question that I had in my mind is like, yes, we know we need to transition to a green transition, but we know that transition is going to be quite rough. We haven't found at least a replacement that is as stable, as energy dense. I wondered if you have any thoughts on that actually, because I've not really heard much about people actually talk about the feasibility of a green transition. They just talk about ramping the infrastructure up.
So my first comment, he's right. Fossil fuel is really energy dense. Energy per unit volume, energy per unit weight, energy invested versus energy gone out. It's incredible. It's a miracle. And so there's a reason why the several industrial revolutions really transformed the way we live in the United States and around the world. And especially, it's not even coal, it's going from coal to oil, and it got even better and even more energy dense. So there's nothing I disagree with about that wind and solar are very, needs a lot of space, a lot of land, a lot of everything. Nuclear energy is very dense also, even more dense, but there is visceral reaction in many parts of the world to nuclear energy. They're afraid of radiation, even though if you look at the number of deaths per terawatt hour generated, so it's normalized. Coal is the worst because of all the respiratory illnesses. The mining deaths are small, very small fraction. It's the respiratory illnesses, heart disease, stroke, lung cancer, COPD. Gas is next. It doesn't have the SOx and NOx, but it causes lots of respiratory illnesses. Hydro is third. Nuclear is just a smidgen above wind and solar in safety. Much safer than hydro, because once in a while, a dam will break. Okay, so on average over the entire history of nuclear power, we don't consider solar or wind that dangerous. People do fall from towers or roofs, wind towers and roofs and so on, stuff like that, but it's not fundamentally a dangerous thing. So wind and solar down here, there's nuclear up here, hydro's here, Natural gas is here and coal's way up here, okay? So what's the problem? Well, there's an irrational fear. And they're afraid of contamination. I personally think if you can build small modular nuclear power plants on time, on budget, because right now that's another thing preventing nuclear from taking over is there's emotional resistance, which slows up the building, and we forgot how to build them on time, on budget. And so there's a generation of power plants that are being designed so they're much smaller. Instead of a gigawatt, they would be 100 megawatts or 10 megawatts. And they could be made in a factory, shipped out as a unit, installed, run for 5 years, hopefully 10 years, go back to the factory, and you deal with the recycling of the fuel, or it's not recycling the fuel. You don't recycle, you put it in deep storage. We're going to need some sort of emergency generation power for sure, depending on where we live. In the United States, to get to 80% renewable, which is some of the best resources in the world, you need 3 days of energy storage. What that means is enough energy to run on energy stored power for 3 full days. And doesn't sound like much for 80%, but it's about a few thousand times more energy storage than we have today. Okay. And pumped hydro is the only good storage source available. And by pumped hydro, you mean you have a hydroelectric dam, and down below you have a few percent little pond. So you let the water run down, you keep that. And when you have excess wind or solar or whatever, you pump it back up. And so I've been saying that pumped hydro is going to be the battery of choice. Every time you have an existing hydro dam, putting a little pond, and the fact that you have very efficient turbines that go both way and variable speed turbines, it can change the landscape. The batteries, in order to keep price within 50% of electricity price in the United States, techno-economic study by former RPE employees when I was there said that the cost of battery storage has to drop by about a factor of 10 from where it is today. I see a factor of 2 or 3. I do not see a factor of 10 in today's technology. So, and that's in the United States. In Europe, you're going to need much more energy storage. In Japan, Korea, Taiwan, any isolate where there's no transmission, you're going to need much more energy storage. So these are some of the things that you need. So it's going to be, you have 2 choices: natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration, or nuclear with spent fuel disposal. Now, they're very different. They're viewed very differently, and the amount of carbon sequestration is like 9 times the amount of spent fuel nuclear. And so it's the public having to deal with this. But look, after Ukraine invasion, even Germany's beginning to think they're going to keep their last remaining nuclear power plants online. And I'm trying to convince them maybe another generation of small guys until we figure out how to make really cheap batteries. But you need compact sources. The batteries themselves are more compact, but they have issues themselves. So it's a very complicated problem. When people say we can be 100% renewable in 20 years, we have some faculty members at Stanford who've been saying that for 20 years. and anybody who's really looked at what's possible is saying, no, not even in 20 years will we be down to 80% renewable. So the challenges are enormous. But these are the things that research should be working on. And I think, sadly, the Russian invasion of Ukraine brought home the fact that many countries in Europe didn't really have a plan. We don't have a plan in the United States either, a real step-by-step plan to get to 2030, to 2040, to 2050, when everybody says we're we're going to be, carbon neutral by 2050. Remember all the stuff: agriculture, power, transportation, processing, plastics, everything gone. And so it's going to be very challenging.
Thank you. A thought-provoking
But what he
question.
says is right. High energy density.
Very nice. Thank you. Edward, please.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Edward, 19 years old, currently based in Singapore. So, Mr. Steven, just now you mentioned more about the technologies as well as the R&D put into the climate change aspect. But what about the human factor behind it? Like just now you talk about public seriousness into transiting from beef to like pork to like chicken, as well as like you mentioned in your introduction address that you have no aircon in your house, but I'm guilty of having one. Yeah, so just curious, how do you view the aspect of human factor in this aspect, and how can we like instead of increase the demand, but also to decrease the increase the supply, but also to decrease the demand from the human side, such that we can aim to achieve carbon neutral in the near future?
Yeah, a lot of it is human factor. A lot of it is all sorts of things that you feel like if you're a renter, for example, you pay the utility bill, okay, but you have no control about how efficient your apartment is. That depends on your landlord. The landlord doesn't really want to spend lots of money making it efficient because they don't pay the utility bill. If they pay the utility bill, I know what will happen. People will turn on the air conditioning and leave their window open. And so you have these other conflicting things. And so it's only when people realize what's the economic and personal cost of these things. There is a driver. The driver should be a worry about the future, but it doesn't hit home how long it will take to make the change and how hard it is. So time is running out because it's like the Titanic, off in the distance, you might see an iceberg, but you may not believe it's there. And you just wait. And then pretty soon you can't turn the ship on time. And so the time lag is not appreciated by the public at all. Just like my example of EVs, if 50% are EVs in 10 years, well, there's 50% that are not, and you got another 20 years. So there's all these things. So the urgency is because it takes so long and it reaches every part of what we do as society. But certainly getting people to understand and be motivated. One more thing that people don't fully understand, the oceans are very cold. And anyone who's done scuba diving or even snorkeling, if you go a few meters down, it gets colder. If the greenhouse gas layer is mounting, as long as the bottoms of the oceans are very close to freezing and remain cold, that's like ice cubes in a glass of water. As long as the ice cubes are there, hey, the water's not really warming up. And so there's an additional time lag in the damage already done because of these cold oceans and a time lag in that. So it's like you've been smoking for 20 or 30 years, you've caused mutations in your lungs, they can lead to serious disease. You don't get cancer or heart disease in the first month of smoking or the first decade of smoking, you get it later on. So the damage accumulates. And so this is what we're doing. We have accumulated damage, most of which is invisible, or a lot of it's invisible. And now, and certainly I think, the extreme weather, the heat waves, the downpours, all this other stuff, it's becoming over the last half decade for sure, and even the last decade, it's become much more apparent that these extremes are increasing. They were predicted long ago, but you say, average temperature going up a little, no, it's lots of other things. And so that urgency is not yet quite felt by everybody. And once you see that, once you see as a farmer, your wells have run dry, and going deeper means you get more salty water. And then all of a sudden you begin, reality hitting home. but most people don't farm. So public awareness is huge. And people in their 70s and 80s, they care about their grandchildren and children. They don't care about grandchildren halfway around the world. I think the younger people have a more universal mindset, attitude about people in the world. But I think, half a century ago, it wasn't there. Society never had to deal with it in our defense. I'm part of this generation. I don't know if that's helpful, but it's or depressing.
Yeah, just like how, I mean, it's very inspiring to also hear that. Thank you, Mr. Steven. So it's like in the past where people are taking note of prices, example for buying food prices, then in the near generation is about the nutrition, but in the near future we are going to talk about more about the carbon and the water that goes behind each food. Yeah, but I'm just really curious, like how can we remind people, like as for myself, I do share around with my friends and such, but I still find it difficult for them to like realize the fact that we are in like a crisis, I suppose. Yeah, so may I just get some
we are in a crisis, but it's a slow-moving crisis and it's profound. And it's so hard to get out of the crisis. And people don't really feel, if you could fast forward 30 years or 50 years and see collapsed nation states because agriculture has collapsed, or rising seas and rising storms mean people who live within a few meters of the ocean are displaced. It drives it home. But, we saw what happened when you have a couple million immigrants from the Middle East want to go to Europe, or from Africa going to Europe, okay? And then there's also a social instability and the closing of the door. We see this in the United States and Central America / Mexico, okay? But when people get desperate and they say, if I stay here, I'm going to die, or, it could be due to gangsters, it could be to collapse agriculture, it could be a lot of things. The world is, if you're rich, you cannot be isolated from the rest of the world. COVID is a living, breathing example. Yeah, it says we just take care of our citizens, forget about the developing world, but then it mutates in the developing world, comes back and bites you. And the political instability and unrest is a big deal. And the whole world pays for this. And I don't think enough people really realize that, hundreds of millions of displaced people is not a good thing. Tens of millions is not a good thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Chloe.
Hi, I'm Chloe. I'm currently a research assistant working in the National University of Singapore. So currently I'm actually working on consumers' perceptions on cultured meat and other meat alternatives. So I think our discussion here is very pertinent to what I'm doing right now. And I think if we look back at Tesselo's comment just now about the accessible labels, I find that a lot of people, even with accessible labels, not a lot of people would look at it in earnest. So they, most of them are more concerned about the price, to be honest. And so it seems that the public is more concerned about the price or financial incentives of their choices. So even with the increased availability of cultured meat and meat alternatives, alternative proteins like mycoprotein and heme protein, not a lot of people are actively accepting these alternatives. So do you think it's better to work with current food systems that we have, or making productions of existing conventional meat more efficient? The way to go in comparison to pouring in a lot of effort to make people change their diets and working on these meat alternatives that the public may not even be very interested in adopting?
Well, first, let me agree with you. Price matters the most in any consumer choice. And anything we buy, it's always about price and cost and money. And then good to the world is secondary. All right. You very rarely are people willing to buy twice the price that has a lower carbon footprint. So number one, the government should work into the price of the carbon footprint what's happening. Now, a price on carbon is one way of doing this. It could do it in various ways. If you say this food, it's a cost to society. Now, what's the cost of society? That's where the debate begins from, climate change and economic models and really what's happening. And so a recent Nobel Prize in economics was given to someone at Yale who tried to put a price on this. And his price was like $45 a ton. This is social cost of carbon. And then depending on who you talk to, some people say that's too low. Many people say that's too low. It should be $100 a ton or even higher. A few people say, no, it shouldn't be anything. But how do you get that social cost into the things we do? Because the society does pay a price for this type of behavior, these choices. So fixing a price by taxing it or doing is something. You either make it illegal or you tax it. For food, it's going to have to be some sort of tax. Yeah. To make meat illegal would cause riots in the streets. Now, regard to your question, you have these very exotic artificial meats, or you have vegetable-based things like Impossible Foods, or you just get plants, develop a taste for plants and some essential proteins to make that more nutritious. That's, of course, the lowest carbon footprint possibility. But again, we don't know. I think these very exotic things that people are toying with are more experimental. Impossible Foods, a good friend of mine from Stanford started that. He's a biochemist. And I have to tell you a very quick story. I don't know how many people there are like 3 people who haven't spoken yet. Is that about right?
I'm watching the time. That's fine. We have time for a story.
So he said, Steve, you'll be proud of me. I quit my job at Stanford. And I said, you did what? And he said, well, you were willing to become Secretary of Energy. Well, I don't have any talent in energy and things like that, so I know what I can do. So I quit my job as a biochemist. As a biochemist, can I use vegetable material to make something taste as good as meat? And that's the founding of Impossible Foods. It's not bad. My only beef is that it's too salty. but and it's certainly better than some of the others. But it's also more expensive. And so price does matter. Compared, good ground beef to Impossible choices, it's 50% more. And so that has to, now in the long run, somehow my intuition says, if it's plants and you're not raising beef, surely you can figure out how to make those things cheaper. But right now, the chemistry involved, which is they're using yeast to make some of the molecules that give it the blood red taste. And so they're imitations of hemoglobin and other things like that. But that's pretty expensive. And so it's a technology thing if you want to really mimic, and then the texture they haven't figured out. You can't make it steak. Okay, so chicken nuggets, the chicken's so unidentifiable, it's easy to make a fake chicken nugget, but that's not even real food. But anyway, so I think it's choice. I go back to the dream. Let's try to raise a younger generation that really like vegetarian as a taste choice. And occasionally you get some a little exotic meat thing, okay? But so I think the market will and the incentives will fix this. The artificial meats, they're putting in nutrients that are from animals, so you're going to have to replace all those nutrients from animals with plant-based stuff as well. It's not enough to get a few animal cells and grow artificial meat, and then you can laser print them to make it look like a steak. You can see where this is going to be very expensive initial stuff. So it's complicated, but I think the market will have to figure this one out, and the incentives, and the proper tax on the damage, so you drive the price in the right direction, which I think is very fair.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Umesh, please.
Hello, I am Umesh from Nepal. I have a
Just a sec, I gotta hold on.
Okay.
When I talk, I get warmed up and then my brain goes. And so even though you're not exercising, you're generating a lot of heat. So I just turned on the fan because it's hot outside.
It's a small concession. It's a small concession to the heat. It's impressive. You must be the first former energy secretary in the United States not to use air conditioning in modern times, I'm quite sure.
Probably. It's good. We can manage. Unless it's all summer of triple digits.
Then, yeah, sure.
Then then I move. But go on.
Umesh from Nepal, please carry on.
Okay, what I'm saying is that what if we could hit the people behavior by their culture, like that if we could convince them that 2 degrees Celsius is beyond the hell, like that, or something more in other culture, like what here in my Nepal is that there is a many culture which is directly related to the nature and climate. So what if we could could relate them to their culture and the climate change, and then can change their behavior? I think do you think that is more easy than the scientific solution, or what do you say?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think if you look at many peoples, a lot of indigenous peoples, Native Americans, Native people around the world who used to live on the land, they have a reverence toward the environment in general. Very, very different. Okay, and there's these, expressions about taking care of the earth. It's an ancient Native American saying, said, we did not inherit the land from our ancestors. We borrowed it from our children. And this goes across lots of cultures of indigenous people who used to do this way. But that culture is largely gone if you've grown up in a city and in a very industrialized environment, and you're not close to the land anymore. And, a chicken comes in a little white styrofoam thing with a little plastic over it. and that's what it is. You didn't have to slaughter chickens or raise chickens. And so if you can establish these cultures that have existed over millennia, that would be great. This is not a scientific technological magic bullet that we need. We need many magic bullets, but we need changes in the attitude. And the change in attitude goes back to, this very deep Tibetan culture, which is you don't separate yourself from other animals, from other people. You're all part of this. And I spent a week with Dalai Lama in Dharamsala and got this drummed into me. He was wonderful. That if you isolate the world for you and the rest of the world, or you and your family and the rest of the world, it's different than you say, no, we're all part of the same thing, and all sentient beings and all this and the rest of the environment. That's a very deep philosophy that changes your outlook on how you deal with the world and how you view the world as not there for the taking, to use up its resources. And what happens 50 or 100 or 500 years from now, I don't care. It's a very profoundly different attitude. So I, for one, believe that the Tibetan attitude is a much healthier one. And I would wish it possible. It wouldn't be bad to have discussions about that and to try to grow this among younger people, to say, hey, the world is a very small place and you just can't separate yourself from the rest, rich from poor and everything else. The poor get to see what the rich have, and they want and deserve what the rich have. So, secrets out of the back. The good news is, we just gotta let natural birth control take its place, and the population peaks and goes down, and you can still increase prosperity and these things. But a very different attitude about the resources of the earth, I think, is what we do need. So I agree with you.
Yeah, this is so important in my country because here in Nepal, there are lots of cultural diversity, and every culture is directly related to the climate change, or that is to the nature. Like giving an example, we have a Newari culture, which they worship to a particular god called the Indra god. That is a god of the rain. So we know that the rain is directly interrelated to climate change. So we are doing the campaign now to advocate for the climate change, and we are doing the campaign with the help of culture and art, and to make them visualize that, oh look, that our culture is so old, this is older than the scientific science, and we are doing this since before the history of the science, and our culture is related to the nature and climate. So we should think about that, and we should change our behavior to protect our earth and to inherit this planet to the children. So we are doing this, and I hope this will help to change the behavior of the people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's another deeply ingrained culture after the Industrial Revolution is, and you know, the figure of merit is GDP per capita. GDP per capita, if that's what you want, then you want to build a building, tear it down in 50 years and build another building. It's more GDP. You want to build a refrigerator, not that lasts for 30 years, that lasts for 5 years, and then you make the consumer go and buy another one. You want 2 cars instead of 1. You want all this stuff. And so it's driving consumption, and it's the main driver of industry to grow the business, right? You're successful if the business is growing. Well, what does that mean? You know, like grow the population. You know, all these things are fundamentally unsustainable. And so that has to fundamentally change. Every CEO of every company, you know, their marching orders is to grow your market, grow the business, and make things more disposable. So you have to go and get another one. And if you're rich enough, you can do this. So this is okay. Enough said about culture.
So it's a recipe for disaster, to be sure. But Steve, you just dropped in the fact that you spent a week with the Dalai Lama. I think you should probably explain how that came to be.
Oh, well, this was around 2000. First, the Dalai Lama came to Stanford, but then there was some mind life thing, and I was asked, there were going to be 5 scientists, and we all go to Dharamsala, and we spend the morning, and each of us will talk about the science. I gave a PowerPoint presentation to the Dalai Lama for 3 hours, but it wasn't just a one way. I would say something, he would ask questions, and it was a back and forth. And then we broke for lunch, and in the afternoon we would talk about, you know, the repercussions of this in philosophy and religion and sociology and ethics. And it was great because there's 5 scientists, there are a few, and a bunch of Tibetan monks. Richard Gere, he's a long-term Tibetan Buddhist type, was there, as was Goldie Hawn, and it was and some of the things we would tell the Dalai Lama, we talked about things like, what's the beginning of life? And he would say, well, it's natural, is when the egg gets fertilized and it's in the mother's womb, and that's life. We're saying, well, no, not quite, because a lot of times the mother will abort the fetus, but something goes wrong at the really early stages. And due to evolution, it wants to be very efficient. It doesn't want to carry something very defective. So many times the woman doesn't even know they're pregnant, and it's done. So Dalai thinks, really? And said, yeah, this is the evidence, this is what we know. He said, well, maybe not then, but maybe after it can survive and something. And so he was just thinking out loud. You know, what he thought was a clear-cut definition has been blurred by biology. Forget about medicine. And at that point, I said to him, you know, we're having this we have this big debate on stem cell stuff in the United States during Bush 2. And stem cells, if it's made from fetal stem cells, you think that this is really bad. And so we don't know what, there's a big honest debate because, so what if, so I posed this question to him and said, what if, and we do a lot of medical research on animals and we kill the animals. And when we kill the animals, it can sometimes lead to a cure. So let's say, hypothetically, suppose you have a dear friend, has a fatal disease, but it now has 100% cure due to this medical research that killed sentient beings. What would you do? Okay. So he says, well, let me tell you, suppose you're a Tibetan monk and you go to a village and they want to honor you, so they have a feast and then they serve you meat. And there are no rules that forbid you from eating meat. You don't like meat, but there are some options. You can say, no, I don't want meat, but it will crush the feelings of the host, and you have to consider that. Or you can just say, okay, I'm willing to do this, but the only rule is if they slaughtered the animal because they heard you were coming, you should refuse it because it's a bad precedent. But other than that, you should weigh your, returning hospitality, this and that, and said there are no rules. And what does this have to do with stem cell research? And he said, the damage has been done. Looking forward, what do you have to think about it? There is no rule. You have to think about it. And at this point, I said, will you be president of the United States? And he wags his finger at me and says, no. You live in the United States, you have a president. You have to respect the leader. I said, I'm just kidding. But this guy was amazing, right? He's willing to think out loud. It's no religious dogma. And you just have to think about it. And you're a responsible person. You have to think about what you think is right, based on the Tibetan philosophy of you're not separated from the rest of the world. Anyway.
There's an awful lot in that. Thank you for telling us about that. I mean, the personal responsibility and this idea of thinking out loud, it's so rare. People just come up with, they feel they have to know before they open their mouths.
I would say that the Pope would not do that. So here's a religious leader, right, of Tibetan Buddhism, willing to do this. So I went back and told my research about it, and they looked at me and said, are you going to be a Tibetan Buddhist? And I said, if there's any religion I'm going to be, it's going to be that one. He was very impressive.
Thank you. Right, onwards. Henry, please.
Okay. Hi, I'm Henry, 23 years old, currently just graduated from the University of Hong Kong. I actually want to ask some question regarding hydroelectric that you have mentioned a while before. We have all noticed how powerful and how beneficial this type of energy source can be, but we all also know that the development of hydro energy can be a little bit messy, like put in the simplest statement, because developing the hydroelectric dam can affect the nearby environment a lot. There will be a lot of people getting affected by this development, not to mention its change to the natural environment. Additionally, nowadays, people are also worrying about the cross-country water usage that will be affected by the construction of hydroelectric dams. So we can all see that like the development of hydroelectric dam can be quite a messy process. So I just want to ask you, how do you think we can navigate between all these factors and ensure that the development of hydroelectric power benefits everyone? Yeah.
Very, very tough question. If hydro used unwisely, it can kill the downstream river. It can do many, many things, not just the place and the people upstream. Also, the manipulation of rivers have profound impact on regions and countries downstream, because, and we had water wars that are century old in the Colorado River in the United States that are really out of date, literally a century old, and they have to be rethought because the water was being misused and all sorts of things. And so these are very, very tough questions. China diverting hydro so India doesn't get some of the hydro is going to be devastating to India, right? So all of these things are huge. And how do you change that or do this is going to be an international, very ticklish problem. But in the end, just because you're upstream doesn't give you the right to take all the water or misuse the water or something like that. And there has to be an international recognition of this because, you know, what you may be upstream for this, you may be downstream in something else. And so these are very, very hard problems and how to deal with it. So all the good things about hydro are there, but there are really some bad things as well. And so we're trying to rethink the Colorado River now. It's going to take a decade at least.
Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, we don't give Mexico a lot of this water.
Yeah.
And a lot of the Rio Grande is running kind of dry. And so just wait 10 or 20 years and it's going to get much worse.
Brishan, please.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Brishan from Singapore. And as a teenager living in a low-lying island, I would say that the people of my generation, like those from the rest of the world, we really have our own hopes and dreams in a habitable future. We all hear about how we need a radical shift in terms of combating climate change in our lifestyle choices, in energy capture. But for much of the decade, countries like Singapore only accounted for 0.1% of global carbon emissions. So my question is, what role realistically do small countries like Singapore or other countries in the global south really have in the fight against climate change? Because ironically, I really feel like the smallest and poorest countries in the world, from the Maldives to Mozambique, is really bearing the brunt of climate change and have the biggest impacts on well-being. And secondly, on nuclear energy, I personally believe that nuclear power is the path forward, but I feel like it may not be feasible for countries like Singapore or Somalia to have a nuclear power plant. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So first, the role of Singapore, went through a revolution from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest, with no natural resources, besieged and unfriendly neighbors, and so the question is, why should Singapore is just a little thing, Denmark's just a little country, well, very forward-leaning countries. Scandinavia also, what role does it really matter? It's really what the US States, EU, the United States, China, India, the big countries, Russia, what did they do? And the answer, I think, is world-leading small countries can set an example of what to do. That could be best practices that other countries can pick up. Now, I agree with you 100% that the poorest countries bear the brunt of this for sure. And that's the injustice of all this, because they contribute nothing to the problem and they pay the biggest price to the problem. And the rich countries, the United States leading the way and followed by Northern Europe, have had the benefit for hundreds of years of living high in the pig, so to speak, high in the hog, and developing very bad habits. And so I think it's those rich countries who also have to lead the way and say we're really committed, which includes many, many things: technology, best practices in government, and cash transfer. Okay, and so I'm in favor of all those things. But I think Singapore, it's a intellectual powerhouse now, and so it can help lead the way, just as Northern Europe can help lead the way in many government policies, public attitudes, and invention and discovery. So is that helpful? You're punching way above your weight. It's a good thing.
Certainly, yeah, definitely.
What about Brishan's second question about small-scale nuclear power stations?
Okay, so here's the thing. Singapore is a very small place, it's very landlocked. If you get a contamination problem in Singapore, the show is over, right? You can't, and so that's why if Singapore wants nuclear, Hawaii, same issue. Hawaii generates its energy by diesel and bunker fuel oil, and there's not enough wind or solar. So it's the same issue. Before Hawaii or Singapore or any place like that, it's very small, very isolated. They have to be, teeny tiny little probability that you're going to have a contamination issue. And so going back to these small nuclear power plants, they have to be walk away safe, deprived of electrical power, cooling water, anything. They will never melt down. They will never leak. They could stop working, but they will never leak. It's like a good battery that will never leak. And before Singapore has that, they should not put in nuclear. I agree. But that's also true of Hawaii and a bunch of other places. So you can, it's going to be decades to test the technology and really find out. We don't have enough nuclear accidents to really see. And I'm a big fan of looking not at the ones that actually lead to a partial meltdown or contamination, but all the what I call the near hits. That is, you just avoided an accident. How do you analyze that? How can you make it so you never even get close to an accident? And part of it has to be in inherent design, and part of it has to be in the operators. All this is, but and they get safer and safer and safer. We fly airplanes and we drive cars, and they're getting safer and safer. Right. But contamination is a real emotional issue.
Thank you very much indeed, Brishan. Really important points you brought to the conversation. We've discussed so much, and everybody has spoken, I'm pleased to say. And now I see 3 hands raised. I'm going to come to you all. Elaine, first, you're back with us, so go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I'm loving our conversation so far. So since the beginning, we mentioned about food sustainability, and then to energy, to transition, and so on. So while we are emphasizing on all these aspects about climate change, I actually have a question. Something just popped out in my mind about inequality. Let's say for certain, let's take food sustainability as an example. In certain countries, like let's say in resource limiting countries, food sometimes is actually, a privileged choice for them. And when we mentioned about, let's say tech transfer and everything, food behavior change, and it needs time. What is your take about in, let's say, low and middle income countries regarding like climate change, and how do they adapt better in this sense when they have like limiting resources in terms of energy, in terms of food? What is your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, you want to make the food production cheaper, and there's another problem, and that is with industrialized farming, and you can ship anywhere in the world. If you are competing with local farmers, which maybe don't have as much energy, or the soil's not rich with much mechanization, all these things, you're a complete disadvantage to, what rich countries and huge mechanized farming and all this other stuff can do. And so what that does is consolidates food production in what might be a pretty unhealthy thing, because if there's a disruption of supply, if there's anything else that goes wrong, just look at what was happening. Wheat was grown in Ukraine and Russia, and all of a sudden people in Africa are doing, they're facing huge food shortages because of that. And so keeping alive indigenous inefficient farming has some certainly advantages, but the economic push was going in the wrong direction. There's a realization that you're willing to put what's more inefficiency to get more resiliency, even if it's something as trivial as you have more inventory or more local suppliers. And food production gets to the heart of all this stuff, right? So I used to think when I was very young, your age, that I watched, I worked in Japan and I watched, these little 1 acre plots of land and people were kind of farming by hand. And where land is so precious in Japan, it's 80% mountains, that, this is ridiculous. But there was something about this that maybe wasn't so ridiculous. Plus, the Japanese are very, very peculiar about the rice. So, but anyway, but just going back to this, these are deep questions, and how do you deal with this stuff? I think one has to take a more holistic view. Can you really make multi-crop farming productive? Because we know that monocrops have all sorts of downsides, but can it really compete with industrialized farming? Organic farming cannot. Organic farming is, I think, a luxury of rich people. When you're in a poorer country, you just want enough food you can feed people, and in the cheapest way possible, it keeps the farmers alive. And so there's all sorts of issues like that. But it's sad. I mean, when I was in Africa, I watched these things. They have these non-bred cattle that go, in the United States, 18 months, cattle after 18 months are 2,400 pounds before slaughter. Pigs, 24 weeks, 280 pounds. They're little machines that convert food into animal mass. And I look at these, African cattle that are 2 or 3 years old, they're little scrawny things. And it was like, the breeding, and I said, why don't you get, bred modern things? That costs too much. So there's all sorts of inequities. And but I tell you one thing that should have been there, and then we need a new economic model. With cheap solar, you can pump water and you can irrigate. You don't need energy storage for that. And that has not taken root in many places either. And that's just shameful. When we used to have in the United States, when the wind blows, there's a little wind turbine and pumps water up in the ground, puts in a water tower. Okay, with cheap solar, you can do the same. But someone needs to view this as a business opportunity. Right.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Tassilo.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I study hospitality management, which focuses on travel and tourism. And when looking at tourism, it's very energy intensive and it's travel as well. So I'd like to kind of give power to the solutions and kind of talk about a few examples we use in the sustainable hotel operations. So, for example, we use the geothermal energy to heat spa areas and others. We use the IT heat from servers to, for example, heat up the water in the kitchen, and use groundwater for air cooling. Then when we look at travel, we've got upcoming eVTOLs like Lilium, Volocopter or Vertical, who are fast, cheaper, but require a lot of energy. When do you think the trend, when do you think the commercialization of nuclear fusion is coming?
Don't hold your breath. Nuclear fusion, it's still a scientific experiment, and the risk and the capex expense of delays and things. Normal nuclear power plants, if they're about $8 to $10 billion per gigawatt power production, if they're 2 weeks behind schedule, they've made a financial hole that most utility companies cannot come out of. And so you have even a worse issue with fusion, because the capital expense investment is going to be at least 10 billion, 20 billion. So the first couple, of course, is nation states or alliances of countries will have to get together. But the question is, at what point will it ever become viable for a utility company to do this? Even in France, the country is taking back over the control of their nuclear industry, because when they let them make a profit. They begin to cut corners and maintenance things and all sorts of issues. And even with government taking care of liability issues, that wasn't good enough. So these are very, very complicated things. A lot of the things you talked about, it's always going to be a matter of cost. But one thing you were on the fringe of, in many examples, they were the heart of it, is energy efficiency. Okay, now energy efficiency. Why aren't people paying more attention to energy efficiency? Is a really good question. And the free market economists say there are no $20 bills to be waiting to be picked up. And so that energy efficiency is a very big deal. And how do you incentivize people to become more energy efficient? You know, buildings to be energy efficient, everything to be energy efficient. And not only energy efficient on a per use basis, but energy efficient over, you want the thing to last longer, you want the thing to be repairable, because, you know, in pursuit of a growth of business, we're making them unrepairable on purpose, right? And then it's a throwaway economy. So you think single use, plastic bags are bad. Think about designing something single use and then you throw away the car after 10 or we can make cars last 30 years. Okay. But now in cars, it's a little different because you want more efficient cars. But buildings, you can make a building frame that can last hundreds of years, but design it so you can modernize the HVAC system, everything else inside. So we have iconic buildings that are hundreds of years old, but they weren't designed that way. And then someone decided to make a huge investment. We can start design buildings to make them, the shell to make them last hundreds of years and yet still be efficient. Because it's really inefficient to make all that steel and concrete and tear it down in 50 years. Or if you're in China in 30 years.
Great point. If I can hold on to that, is, for example, supersonic flights, boom, supersonic. They created a supersonic airplane that runs on 100% sustainable aviation fuel. And what they did is they constructed the airplane in a way where they focus on the deconstruction of the airplane first before the construction. And I feel like that's kind of a topic that's never really talked about, additional to the intelligent utilization of resources, for example, energy efficiency. And yeah, I feel like transparency, coming back to my first point, is crucial for that. If we don't understand where the problem lies and can't compare it to other examples, I feel like it's really hard to find a solution. And
well, first, let's separate out sustainable fuel, low carbon footprint or zero carbon fuel from whether you want to fly at supersonic speeds or subsonic speeds. Supersonic costs more energy, period. You want aviation fuel, high density fuel, liquid hydrocarbon densities that are ideally carbon neutral. We haven't been able to do that yet. There's still the hope. There was a little breakthrough of algae. ExxonMobil invested Craig Ventnor and Ham Smith, who was a Nobel laureate. And they got the production of sunlight, algae to lipids to kerosene up fivefold in yield and close. That's good. It needs another factor of 2 or more to be competitive. And fuel is about a third or a quarter of the cost of an airplane ticket. So it's a major part. And so the technology to get sustainable fuel is a huge, and airplane jet fuel is the last thing to replace. Now, you mentioned the battery powered airplanes this month. I'm on the board of a company that's supplying the batteries for that. That's not a long-term solution to heavyweight long distance transportation until we triple the energy density by weight. and we're far from that. But we make the highest energy density batteries, but it's not that great. So it seems very exotic and everything, but public transportation is still better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Tesla. Right, we must finish, but I'll just a 30-second comment from POC, because you've been very patient, and then a 30-second closing comment from Steve, just to sort of wrap it all up, and then we'll finish.
Oh, thanks, Adam. Well, first, thanks so much for your hospitality and generosity, Steve. And I think like I've traveled continents just learning across the past hour and a half. So thank you very much. I just have a quick question. This is actually a question from our colleague. Shout out Margarita. Her question is actually on the concept of planetary boundaries with donut economics. So planetary boundaries are kind of like how much our planet can take, right? What are the bounds of our natural environment? Do you think it's time for us to develop within planetary boundaries? Because we still are running a narrative of growth and growth and growth. Thank you very much.
No, if I understand your question correctly, after we've trashed this planet, should we migrate to something else? Is that what you're hinting at? Just as curiosity?
No, so it's planetary boundaries is kind of developing within what our oceans can take, what our land can take, and it's developing that way.
Don't know because technology has always come to the rescue. If you turn the clock back to the days before artificial fertilizers, the president of the British Association for Advancement of Science said, we're in great peril. We're running out of saltpeter from South America and bird guano. And unless we can get artificial fertilizer, we'll starve to death. Okay, because rotating crops wasn't good enough and the population was increasing. And so he actually set off a race of chemists that developed the Haber-Bosch process. So the winners were Haber and Bosch. Haber got a Nobel Prize for that, but it had such a profound impact on the ability to feed people that they gave Carl Bosch for the same thing. They made up another Nobel Prize years later of high temperature, high pressure catalysis, but it was the same process. Years after that, some surface chemists figured out how the Haber-Bosch process works. So they gave another Nobel Prize, and they said, at last, we're beginning to understand in fundamental chemistry and physics how it works. Okay, 3 Nobel Prizes for fertilizer because they had such a ground. Norman Borlaug for crossbreeding dwarf strains of wheat. They started with wheat, then corn, rice, and all these other things, all this other stuff. So what we thought were limitations and boundaries of a world of 1 billion or a fraction of 1 billion, now 7.5 billion. And we have a food wealth distribution problem more than we have a production problem. Okay, and so you can never tell what the boundaries are. But I can also in that same breath finally say that, but don't expect that technology is going to save you every time. And I tell you what technology will not save, and that's the Ponzi scheme we're all on, which to grow the economy, you have to have more young people than old people. Okay, and so you want to promote population growth. But that's bad. That's a Ponzi scheme. Because in the end, if you go to 11 billion, then you go to 12. It took millennia to get the first billion. It's taking 13 years to get the next billion, where we currently are. This is crazy. Okay, and now when people in all cultures have fewer babies, and they have, and this is a good thing, but now what the political leaders are doing? They're having incentives to have people have more babies because they want the Ponzi scheme to continue so they can grow the GDP and per capita and everything else. This is crazy. Okay, so if you really think about what sustainability means, you get off the Ponzi scheme of having more and more babies and you want the natural birth control to take effect. When people get wealthy, they have fewer kids. That's a good thing.
Splendid. Thank you very, very much. Interesting point, POC. Thank you to all of you for bringing such wonderful diversity of topics to the conversation. And it's been amazing to sit here and listen to you all. Steve, thank you to you. Do you want to just say one last closing thing, and then.
Well, I
we'll go.
mean, I think most of your questions are good. They're thoughtful. They're also trying to prick holes in, this good thinking that, it's more complicated than that. But also I got the impression that all of you really care about what happens in the world. Not just you, your family, your friends. And so that's very important. And, some of these questions you asked are very difficult, very hard, but they have to be asked, and we have to figure out how to get solutions to these things. But the most important thing is to care about the world and people and the world around you beyond just your own immediate circle, because the world is so small now. What each of us does affects everybody else.
Thank you, everybody. Wishing you a great day.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.